The morning of the wedding, Miss Georgiana Price stood in her white gown and screamed one word across the courtyard of Stonefield Abbey. Out! She pointed a shaking finger at a young maid holding a basket of white roses. The maid froze. Every servant in the yard froze with her. "Lock her in the laundry!" Georgiana screamed again, louder this time, her veil shaking with the force of her own voice. "I will not have that face curse my vows." Two footmen grabbed the maid by the arms. Her cap slipped sideways as she was dragged across the cobblestones. For 1 second, just one, the cap fell to the ground. Old Mr. Osmond Cole, the butler, was standing by the chapel door with a silver tray in his hands. He had carried that tray for 40 years. He had carried it through funerals, christenings, and 100 dinners for 100 important people. He dropped it. The tray hit the stone steps and rang out like a bell across the whole courtyard. Every head turned. Cole did not look at the tray. He was staring at the back of the maid's neck, where her collar had slipped, where a small crescent-shaped mark showed clearly behind her left ear for 1 bare second before someone pulled her cap back into place. At that same moment, at the chapel door, Duke Rainer Stonefield opened a telegram that had just arrived by urgent messenger. He read it once. He read it twice. The color drained from his face like water from a cracked jug. Within 1 hour, this wedding would be stopped. Not by rain, not by illness, not by a runaway groom, by a name. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Now let us go back. Back 1 full year, to the day it all began, long before any wedding was ever planned. Her name, as far as anyone at Stonefield Abbey knew, was Effie. No last name, no family, no history. She had come to the Abbey as a girl of 9, delivered by a country parson who said only that she had been found, alone, wrapped in a blanket, with no letter, no locket, no clue. The housekeeper at the time had shrugged and put her to work scrubbing pots. That was 12 years ago. Effie was 21 now. She scrubbed floors before dawn and polished silver until midnight. She was told, more times than she could count, that she was lucky to have a roof at all. She believed it. She had no reason not to. She did not know she had a birthmark behind her left ear shaped like a crescent moon. Her cap covered it always. She did not know that mark was the reason her whole life was about to be pulled apart, piece by piece, by a woman who smiled while she did it. That woman was Mrs. Agatha Price. Mrs. Price had come to Stonefield Abbey a year before the wedding, brought as a guest of the old Dowager Duchess, who was a distant cousin of hers. Mrs. Price had a daughter, Georgiana, unmarried at 24, beautiful, sharp-tongued, and desperate for a title. The Price family had money, a great deal of money, more than a family of their standing should reasonably have. Nobody at the Abbey asked where it came from. Nobody thought to ask. On the second morning of her visit, Mrs. Price came down early for prayers in the small family chapel. The staff knelt at the back, as was custom. Effie knelt among them, tired from having been up since 4, her cap slightly crooked from a hurried dressing. A draft from the door lifted the edge of her cap. Mrs. Agatha Price, sitting in the front pew, turned her head at the wrong moment and saw it. The crescent mark. Small, pale, exact. Her face changed, not with confusion, with recognition. She said nothing that morning. She said nothing that week. But from that day forward, Effie's life at Stonefield Abbey began to come apart. One small cruelty at a time, and Effie never once understood why. Within days, the housekeeper informed Effie that her room, a small but warm chamber on the second servant's floor, was needed for a visiting lady's maid. Effie was moved to the attic. The Stonefield attic in winter held the cold like a fist. In summer, it held the heat the same way. Nobody explained why the change was sudden. Nobody explained why it was permanent. Her half-day off, the one afternoon a fortnight when she was allowed to walk into the village and breathe air that did not smell of lye soap, was canceled for the season. The season did not end. Georgiana Price, newly engaged to the Duke by then, found a new use for her tongue. At tea in front of two visiting ladies, she pointed her spoon toward Effie, who was pouring cream, and said sweetly, "Some faces sour a room. We keep ours in the scullery." The two visiting ladies laughed politely, the way people laugh when they do not understand a joke but do not wish to seem rude. Effie kept pouring. Her hand did not shake. She had learned long ago that a shaking hand only invited more cruelty. But somewhere behind her, old Cole, arranging the sideboard, went very still. Cole had been at Stonefield Abbey for 41 years. He had served the old Duke, and the Duke before him, and he had loved a man named Colonel Edmund Hartwell more than he had loved almost anyone in his life. Colonel Hartwell had been the guardian of the young Duke Rainer after his own father died, a soldier and a gentleman who had raised the boy like a son, and asked for nothing in return but honor. Colonel Hartwell had a daughter once, a little girl with dark curls and a crescent birthmark behind her left ear. Her name was Elowen. She had disappeared 9 years ago at the age of 12 in the chaos after the colonel's sudden death and the collapse of his estate. Some said she had died of fever on the road. Some said she had been taken in by distant relations, who never wrote back. Cole had never believed either story, and Cole had never forgotten that mark. He said nothing yet. He was an old man who had learned patience the hard way. But that night, in his small pantry room behind the silver stores, he unlocked a drawer he had not opened in almost 2 years. Inside lay a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, and beneath it, wrapped in cloth, a small gold locket shaped like a crescent moon. He looked at them a long time, then he locked the drawer again. Not yet, he told himself. Not yet. 2 weeks later, disaster nearly finished Effie for good. A visiting lady, a friend of the Prices named Mrs. Ashworth Klein, arrived for a weekend of hunting and cards, wearing a diamond and sapphire brooch that had belonged to her late mother. On the second evening, the brooch went missing from her dressing table. The house was turned upside down. Drawers searched. Servants questioned one by one, their faces pale with fear, because a servant accused of theft in 1908 did not simply lose a position. She lost every reference, every hope of future work, sometimes her freedom. The brooch was found in Effie's small wooden box under her attic bed, wrapped in a stocking. Effie had never seen it before in her life. She said so, over and over, her voice cracking, while 2 footmen held her arms, and the housekeeper's face went hard as stone. "Send for the constable," Georgiana said, not even looking up from her needlework. "Thieves must be dealt with properly." It was Cole who stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, miss," he said, his voice even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had watched 40 years of household dramas rise and fall. "But I was in the corridor outside that room the entire evening in question, seeing to the wine. I saw no one enter but the chambermaid assigned to that floor, who is not Effie." It was not entirely true. Cole had not stood in that corridor the whole evening, but no one dared call the butler of Stonefield Abbey a liar in front of guests, and the constable was never sent for. Mrs. Ashworth Klein, embarrassed, later found the brooch had slipped behind her own dressing table drawer, caught on a splinter of wood, or so it was quietly decided, once the fuss had died down, and nobody wished to examine the matter too closely. She came to the kitchen herself, in a plain morning dress, and apologized to Effie directly, in front of the whole downstairs staff, pressing a coin into her hand that Effie tried politely to refuse. Georgiana watched this apology from the doorway with a face like curdled milk. Mrs. Agatha Price watched it too, from the shadow of the stairs, and her eyes narrowed to 2 thin lines. "No witnesses next time," she murmured to her daughter that night, so quietly that only a maid dusting the hall table, pretending not to listen, heard it at all. That maid told no one. She was too afraid. But somewhere in a small chapel room across the Abbey grounds, a new chaplain, recently arrived to fill the post left empty by old Reverend Wick's retirement, sat late into the night copying names into a heavy leather register. Baptisms, marriages, deaths. Every servant who had passed through Stonefield Abbey in the last 15 years, cross-checked against a list only he carried, folded inside his prayer book. His name was Reverend Aldous Finch. Almost nobody at the Abbey knew that Duke Rainer Stonefield had personally arranged his appointment 8 months earlier. Almost nobody knew why. The engagement banquet came at midsummer, the grandest the county had seen in years. 50 guests, crystal glasses, a string quartet. Georgiana Price, glowing in blue silk, sat at the Duke's right hand and told her favorite story of the season, the one that always made the table laugh. "You must hear about our unlucky little foundling," she said, waving her fan toward the corner where Effie stood holding a heavy silver tray of oysters, arms trembling slightly under the weight, forbidden to set it down until called for. Found on a doorstep with no name at all. Can you imagine? We keep her on out of pure Christian charity, though I do sometimes wonder if her face has cost this house its luck. The table laughed. Glasses were raised. Someone made a joke about gypsy curses that made 2 older ladies titter behind their fans. Duke Rainer Stonefield did not laugh. He looked across the table, past his bride-to-be, toward the corner where the tired young maid stood with her tray, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way servants learn to do when they are being mocked and cannot answer back. He looked at her for 1 second too long. Mrs. Agatha Price, sitting 3 seats down, saw exactly where his eyes had gone, and Mrs. Agatha Price, who had built her entire life on knowing which threads to pull and which to cut, filed that look away for later use. Now here is where the story turns, because the viewer deserves the truth the way it truly happened, and not the way it looked from outside. Everyone in the county believed that Duke Rainer Stonefield's search for Colonel Hartwell's lost daughter had gone cold years ago. Private investigators hired, advertisements placed in newspapers as far as Scotland. All of it, it seemed, had led nowhere. That was not true. Reverend Aldous Finch was not simply a chaplain. He was the Duke's own agent, placed inside Stonefield Abbey itself, tasked with quietly reviewing every servant's record, every baptism certificate, every scrap of parish paper that might connect a nameless foundling girl to a dead colonel's daughter. For 8 months he had worked in near silence, filling page after page of his register, narrowing a list of 40 possible girls across 3 counties down to 12, then 6, then 2. One of those 2 names was Effie, and here is the second truth, the one that costs the Duke something to admit even now. 6 weeks before the wedding, Reverend Finch had come to him privately in the small study off the East Gallery and laid a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "Your Grace," Finch had said, "there is a maid in this house, called Effie. No family name recorded, taken in 9 years ago by a parson's referral at an age that matches. A crescent mark is mentioned once in an old laundry inventory note about a scar on her linens being confused with dirt. It may be nothing, but I believe, Your Grace, that it may be everything." The Duke had looked at that paper for a long moment. He had looked at it the way a drowning man looks at a rope he is not sure he deserves to grab, and then he had folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and said, "Continue your inquiries quietly, Reverend. I will not act on a laundry note." That was not the whole reason, and he knew it even as he said it. The wedding was arranged, the contract signed, 2 great houses about to be joined, peace bought with silk and silver, after years of loneliness following his own father's death. If he looked too closely, too soon, at a maid in his own kitchens, he risked a scandal that could cost him the wedding, the alliance, and the quiet life he had finally built for himself. So the Duke, an honorable man in every way the county could see, made one dishonorable choice in private. He chose not to look, not yet, not until it was safer. Even the hero of this story owed a debt, and debts in this kind of tale always come due. Reverend Finch continued his inquiries anyway, because a promise made to a dying man does not care about a wedding date. He requested Effie's laundry records again, more carefully this time. He found the note about the mark mistaken for dirt, dated 9 years back, in the same hand as the housekeeper who had first taken her in. He began, very quietly, asking the old parson who had delivered her to the abbey 9 years before to write down everything he remembered. The old parson remembered more than anyone expected. He remembered a frightened child clutching a small gold locket shaped like a crescent moon, which had been taken from her for safekeeping and never returned. He remembered the child saying, over and over, a name that nobody had believed a 9-year-old could invent. Elowin. Reverend Finch wrote that name into his register with a hand that was not quite steady and underlined it twice. Meanwhile, at the great house, the wedding preparations rolled forward like a carriage with no break. Dressmakers arrived from London. Flowers were ordered by the cartload. Mrs. Agatha Price oversaw every detail with the tight, controlled joy of a woman watching a plan she had built for years come at last to fruit. Because here is the truth about the Price family fortune, the truth nobody at Stonefield Abbey had ever thought to question. Colonel Edmund Hartwell had died 9 years before, suddenly of a fever caught abroad, leaving behind a substantial trust meant entirely for his only child, his daughter Elowin. Mrs. Agatha Price had been a distant cousin of the colonel's late wife, and in the chaos following his death, with no immediate family to press a claim and a missing child presumed lost, she had positioned herself as executor of what remained of the estate. She had told the courts the girl was dead. She had produced a paid witness, a fever, a grave marker in a village nobody ever visited. And she had spent the next 9 years living on Elowin Hartwell's inheritance as though it were her own, buying silk gowns, hunting lodges, and finally, at the greatest cost of all, buying her daughter Georgiana's way into the highest match in the county. Every gown Georgiana wore to Stonefield Abbey, every diamond in her hair, every guinea spent on the coming wedding, it was all Effie's money, Effie's stolen life, worn as jewelry by the woman who had thrown her away, and Agatha Price knew every single day exactly whose face she was looking at across that kitchen. That is why she could not simply dismiss the girl outright, not without risking questions from a household that had grown fond of her steady hands and her quiet kindness. Dismissal would draw eyes. Better to bury her under cruelty instead, to grind her down so far that she would leave on her own, or fade so completely into the background that no one would ever think to look at her twice. It had worked for 9 years. It was working still. Until Reverend Finch underlined a name in his register, and old Cole began, very quietly, oiling the hinges of a drawer he had not opened in 2 years. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday of the month. 300 guests. The largest gathering Stonefield Abbey had held in a generation. 1 week before the ceremony, Mrs. Agatha Price found Georgiana practicing her vows before the mirror in her dressing room and delivered a piece of advice her daughter would remember for the rest of her life, though not in the way her mother intended. "You will banish that maid from any duty near the chapel," Agatha said, watching her daughter's reflection rather than her daughter. "I do not like the way certain eyes follow her. A wedding day must have no distractions." Georgiana laughed, delighted, mistaking cold calculation for motherly wisdom. "You worry too much, Mama. She's a nobody." "She is exactly that," Agatha said, and something in her voice, if Georgiana had been listening closely enough, might have sounded almost like fear. 4 days before the wedding, Cole finally spoke. He came to the Duke's study late one evening, carrying a small wooden box, and asked for a private word. The Duke, exhausted from wedding business, nearly turned him away. But 41 years of service earns a man the right to be heard, and the Duke sat back down. "Your Grace," Cole said, setting the box on the desk, "I have kept something for 20 years that I believe belongs to this house, and to a promise your father and Colonel Hartwell made to each other before either of them was cold in the ground." He opened the box. Inside lay a sealed envelope in Colonel Hartwell's own hand, addressed simply to "Whoever finds my Elowin," and beneath it, a small gold locket shaped like a crescent moon. I found this locket in the Colonel's effects the week he died, Cole said. I was told the child had died with it lost. I never believed that. And 4 nights ago, Your Grace, I saw a mark behind a young maid's ear that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. The Duke did not move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. Which maid, Cole? The one called Effie, Your Grace. The one Miss Price has been treating like a stray dog for the better part of a year. The Duke opened the sealed envelope with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside, in Colonel Hartwell's own careful script, was a letter written in the last months of his life, describing his daughter in full. Her age, her dark curls, and above all, the small crescent birthmark behind her left ear that her mother, God rest her, used to say marked her as touched by the moon itself. The letter ended with a single line that the Duke read 3 times before he could speak at all. If ever you find her, promise me you will not let the world convince her she is nobody. She is everything I loved. Outside the window, the wedding marquee was already being raised on the south lawn, white and enormous, ready for 300 guests who would arrive in 5 days believing they were coming to watch a duke marry a fortune. They were about to watch something else entirely. The Duke sent for Reverend Finch that same night. The 2 men compared the laundry note, the parson's memory of a frightened child saying Elowen over and over, the register with its double underlined name, and the Colonel's letter with its careful description of a birthmark shaped like the moon. It was not proof enough for a courtroom, but it was proof enough for a man who had spent 2 years keeping a promise and had spent 6 cowardly weeks pretending a folded piece of paper did not exist. I should have looked the moment Finch brought me that note, the Duke said quietly, staring at the locket in his palm. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I could not risk the wedding on a laundry inventory. You are looking now, Your Grace, Cole said. Some men never look at all. It may already be too late to stop what I have set in motion. Then, Your Grace, Cole said, in the same even voice he had used for 41 years, we had best move quickly. They moved as quietly as they could, which in a house full of dressmakers, florists, and gossiping footmen was not quiet at all. Reverend Finch quietly gathered sworn statements from the old parson and from a retired physician who had once treated the Colonel's household and remembered the child's mark clearly. The Duke sent an urgent telegram to the Hartwell family solicitors in London, men who had handled the Colonel's estate and who, it turned out, had never been entirely satisfied with the speed at which Mrs. Agatha Price had produced her proof of the child's death 9 years before. The solicitors replied within 2 days. They would send a senior partner to Stonefield Abbey at once, along with the original estate papers, to examine any new evidence personally. He would arrive, by unfortunate coincidence, or perhaps by exact design, on the morning of the wedding. Effie, through all of this, knew nothing. She spent those final days as she had spent every day for 12 years, scrubbing, polishing, carrying, curtsying, absorbing small cruelties the way a stone absorbs rain, without complaint, because complaint had never once helped her before. 2 nights before the wedding, Georgiana Price summoned her directly for the first time in months. You will not set 1 foot near the chapel on Saturday, Georgiana said, not looking up from the veil she was inspecting. Not the flowers, not the aisle, not the vestry. You will remain below stairs the entire morning. Is that understood? Yes, miss, Effie said quietly. Good. Georgiana finally looked up, and there was something almost gleeful in her eyes. Some faces sour a sacrament. I won't have yours anywhere near mine. Effie curtsied and left the room. She did not cry. She had stopped crying over such things years ago, but that night, alone in her cold attic room, she touched the skin behind her left ear, the mark she had covered every day of her life without ever once wondering why anyone should care, and felt, for reasons she could not name, a strange and sudden urge to weep after all. She did not know that a locket, exactly the shape of that mark, was locked in a butler's drawer 2 floors below her. She did not know that a duke, 2 floors below that, was staring at a dead man's letter and asking God for forgiveness he had not yet earned. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and warm, exactly as June mornings in Northamptonshire are meant to arrive. Birds loud in the hedgerows, the marquee gleaming white on the south lawn, 300 guests already beginning to arrive in carriages and motor cars, their crests gleaming on polished doors. Inside the Abbey, Georgiana Price stood being laced into her gown by 3 maids at once, radiant, victorious, already tasting the word Duchess on her tongue. Her mother, Mrs. Agatha Price, moved through the house, checking every detail with the fierce satisfaction of a general on the eve of a victory 9 years in the planning, and in the servants' corridor, carrying a basket of white roses toward the chapel because someone in the general chaos had forgotten to tell her not to, walked Effie. She rounded the corner into the courtyard just as Georgiana emerged in her veil for one final look at the marquee, and their eyes met. Georgiana's face twisted instantly into fury. "You," she said, her voice rising fast, carrying across the whole courtyard where dozens of staff were already assembled for the morning's work. I told you to stay below stairs. I was only asked to carry the flowers to the vestry door, miss. I did not think." "You did not think," Georgiana screamed, and the whole courtyard went silent, every servant freezing where they stood, every guest arriving early enough to witness pausing at the gate. "Out! Lock her in the laundry. I will not have that face curse my vows." 2 footmen seized Effie's arms. Her cap slipped loose as she was pulled backward across the cobblestones, roses scattering white across the stones like snow. And there, exactly as it had happened once already, at the very start of this story, old Cole stood by the chapel door holding his silver tray and saw the crescent mark flash behind her ear and drop the tray to the stones with a crash that rang through the entire courtyard like a bell calling everyone to attention. But this time, Cole did not simply stand frozen. This time, Cole turned and moved as fast as his old legs had moved in 20 years, straight through the chapel doors, straight to where Duke Rainer Stonefield stood at the altar rail in his wedding clothes, just as a messenger reached him from the opposite direction with an urgent telegram from the solicitor's office in London, delayed by an accident on the London road, arriving 1 hour later than planned and 1 hour more dangerous for it. The Duke read the telegram. His face went white. The solicitor and the physician's sworn statement had arrived at the county courthouse an hour earlier. The Hartwell Trust, the telegram confirmed, had been drawing on funds fraudulently certified 9 years ago by a death certificate the coroner's own office now believed to be false. And formal inquiry was already being opened, and the physical description given by the old parson and the retired doctor, cross-checked against Reverend Finch's parish register, matched one servant currently in residence at Stonefield Abbey exactly. Cole reached him at the same moment, breathless. "Your Grace, the girl. They have taken her to the laundry. The mark, Your Grace, I saw it again, clear as day." The organ in the chapel beyond began to play. The Duke closed his eyes for one long second. Then he opened them, and something in his face had changed entirely. The tired resignation of 6 cowardly weeks burned away, replaced by the look of a man who had finally decided to keep a promise no matter what it cost him. "Send for her," he said. "Send for her now, and bring me that locket." The chapel of Stonefield Abbey had never in living memory held so many guests. 300 people crowded the pews and stood along the walls, the largest gathering the county had seen in a generation, exactly as the wedding had been designed to be. A grand public stage for Georgiana Price to become a duchess in front of everyone who mattered. She stood now at the altar in her white gown, veil trembling slightly, glowing with triumph as the vicar opened his book and began the ancient words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here together." The Duke, standing beside her, raised his hand. Stop. The word cracked through the chapel like a gunshot. The vicar froze mid-sentence. 300 guests turned as one, a wave of gasps rolling backward through the pews like wind through a wheat field, whispers dying in 300 throats at once as the entire congregation seemed to stop breathing together. Mrs. Agatha Price, seated in the front pew, rose slowly to her feet, her face draining of color in a way that told everyone watching that whatever was about to happen, she already knew what it was. "Raynor," Georgiana whispered, her hand tightening on her bouquet until the stems creaked. "What are you doing?" The Duke did not look at her. He looked instead toward the chapel doors, which at that exact moment swung open. Standing in the doorway, still in her plain work dress, her cap gone entirely, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and the small crescent mark behind her left ear now visible to anyone who cared to look, stood Effie. The gasp that went through the chapel this time was not a wave. It was a wall. It hit every guest at once, a single sound of 300 people losing their breath together. And then the whispers began, frantic, rising, impossible to stop. Who let the maid in? Is that the girl from the courtyard? What in heaven's name is happening? Cole stood beside her at the door, his hand steady on her arm, guiding her forward the way he might have guided a colonel's daughter down that very aisle 9 years ago, if the world had been even a little kinder. Georgiana spun toward her mother, her face white with fury and fear in equal measure. "Mama, what is this? Mama!" Agatha Price did not answer her daughter. She was staring at the small gold locket now resting in the Duke's open palm, and at the sealed letter Reverend Finch was carrying up the aisle behind Effie, and she understood, with the sudden total clarity of a woman watching 9 years of careful theft collapse in under a minute, that there was no lie left large enough to cover this. The Duke turned to face the full congregation, his voice ringing clear over 300 silenced guests. "6 weeks ago," he said, "I was shown evidence that a maid in this household might be the missing daughter of my late guardian, Colonel Edmund Hartwell. I chose not to look. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong, and I was a coward, and I have spent every day since regretting it." He held up the locket. This belonged to a child named Elowyn Hartwell, who vanished 9 years ago after her father's death. At the same time, her inheritance was quietly claimed by a woman who told the courts the child was dead. Agatha Price made a sound, low and desperate. "This is absurd. This is a servant's fantasy. You cannot possibly." "The county coroner's office," the Duke continued, his voice never rising, never needing to, "opened a formal inquiry this morning into the death certificate you provided 9 years ago, Mrs. Price. The physician who is said to have signed it does not recall ever examining a body. The parson who delivered a frightened 9-year-old girl to Stonefield Abbey that same season remembers her clutching a locket exactly like this one, and remembers her saying over and over a single name." He looked toward the chapel door. Elowyn. Effie, or the girl who had been called Effie for 12 years, stood frozen in the doorway, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears finally coming after 12 years of learning never to let them fall in front of anyone who might use them against her. The Duke walked down from the altar, past his own bride, past 300 guests holding their breath, and stopped in front of her. He held out the locket. "Before God in this county," he said, his voice carrying to the very back pew, "I name Elowyn Hartwell, daughter of Colonel Edmund Hartwell, rightful heir to the Hartwell Trust, and the woman I should have looked for the moment I had the chance." The chapel exploded into sound. Guests rose from their pews 1 row at a time, a slow wave rippling from the front to the back, some in shock, some already whispering the word Duchess under their breath as they looked at the girl in the plain work dress and did the arithmetic that county society always does the moment money and blood realign themselves. Georgiana screamed. It was not a graceful sound. It tore out of her, raw and furious, the same scream she had used in the courtyard not 1 hour before. "You cannot do this." You cannot humiliate me in front of everyone. I am the bride. Raynor, I am your bride." "You banned her from your wedding, Miss Price," the Duke said, and for the first time his voice was cold. "She has just canceled it." Agatha Price lunged forward, not toward her daughter, but toward Reverend Finch and the sealed letter he carried, some desperate animal instinct telling her that if she could only reach the paper and tear it before 300 witnesses, she might yet salvage something. Two of the solicitor's men, who had arrived only minutes before and taken quiet positions near the vestry door, exactly as the Duke had arranged, stepped forward and stopped her before she had crossed 3 feet. "Mrs. Price," said the senior solicitor, stepping out from behind the front pew where he had been waiting, "you are formally notified that the Hartwell Trust inquiry is now active, and that your management of the estate for the past 9 years will be examined in full, beginning this afternoon." Agatha Price's legs seemed to give slightly beneath her. She caught the edge of the pew and did not lunge again. Georgiana turned in a desperate circle, looking for allies among 300 guests who, one by one, were finding it very difficult to meet her eye. The same ladies who had laughed at her joke about the unlucky foundling at the engagement banquet now looked at her the way one looks at a stranger, caught in a lie too large to forgive. The same gentlemen who had toasted her borrowed silk gowns now studied the floor. The crowd that had laughed with her was now the crowd that stared at her, and there was nowhere in that packed chapel for her to hide from 300 pairs of eyes at once. It was the Duke, strangely, who offered her the only kindness left in the room. "Miss Price," he said, and his voice had gone quiet again, tired rather than cruel. "You told this household once that some faces sour a room, and that certain people should be kept in the scullery, out of sight, out of mind. I will not offer you cruelty in return, though God knows you have earned it today. I will offer you the position you once assigned to her. If you wish it, Miss Hartwell's household will have need of a companion, once the dust of today has settled. The wage is modest. The work is honest." The chapel went utterly silent at that, 300 people holding their breath together for the second time that morning, waiting to see which way the moment would break. Georgiana stared at him as though he had struck her. In a way he had, with the one weapon crueler than any insult, which is mercy offered in front of a crowd that has just watched you fall. She turned and fled the chapel, veil streaming, through the very doors her band maid had just walked through, and the congregation, murmuring now like a held breath finally released, watched her go without a single person moving to comfort her. Eloise Hartwell stood at the front of the chapel in her plain work dress, the locket now resting in her own palm, Colonel Hartwell's letter open in Reverend Finch's hands beside her, and looked out at 300 strangers who, 1 hour ago, would not have let her carry their coats. "I do not know how to be who you say I am," she said quietly, and somehow in that packed chapel every single guest heard her. "You do not have to know today," the Duke said. "You only have to be willing to learn it, in your own time, on your own terms. I owe you that much, at least. I owe you far more than that, and I intend to spend as long as it takes repaying it." Old Cole, standing near the door with the broken pieces of a 40-year-old tray still uncollected on the courtyard stones outside, allowed himself, for the first time that morning, a small and private smile. The days that followed moved fast, the way such things always do once the truth is finally let out of its locked drawer. The formal inquiry into the Hartwell Trust concluded within the month. The false death certificate was struck down. The physician who had signed it, it emerged under questioning, had been paid a considerable sum by Mrs. Agatha Price 9 years earlier, and had left the county entirely rather than face a magistrate. Agatha herself was summoned before the trust's executors and ordered to account, penny by penny, for 9 years of spending that had never belonged to her. The Hartwell Trust reverted to its rightful owner in full, with interest calculated for every year it had been withheld, a sum so large that the solicitors themselves seemed faintly astonished reading it aloud. The Price family's grand house in the county, bought with borrowed silk and stolen inheritance, was sold within the year to cover the debt. Mrs. Agatha Price, once the most carefully dressed woman at every dinner table in 3 counties, was last seen by most of Stonefield Abbey's staff climbing into a hired carriage with 2 trunks and no servants of her own to carry them. Georgiana Price did not take the post of companion the Duke had offered her that morning in the chapel. Pride, even shattered pride, does not bend so easily. But 3 months later, with her mother's household gone and her own prospects thinner than she had ever imagined possible, a letter arrived from Stonefield Abbey renewing the offer, this time in Elowin's own hand rather than the Duke's. It was Elowin, not the Duke, who decided that Mercy should be given a second chance to be accepted. Georgiana never wrote back to accept it, but she never destroyed the letter either. Some in the household said she kept it folded in a drawer, the way a person keeps a door they are not yet brave enough to open. Elowin Hartwell moved, in the weeks that followed the wedding that never was, out of the attic and into rooms befitting the daughter of a colonel, though she asked, more than once, whether she might simply be permitted to keep her old room instead, the small warm chamber on the second servant's floor that had been taken from her a year before. The Duke gently told her she could have anything in the house she wished. But perhaps not that, not anymore, because the world she was stepping into required certain rooms of her, whether she wanted them or not. She accepted this the way she accepted most things in those early weeks, quietly, carefully, still half expecting someone to snatch it away again. The first thing Elowin did, once the trust was settled and her position at Stonefield Abbey secured beyond any doubt, was not to buy a single new gown, though the solicitors urged her toward London dressmakers within the week. Instead, she called old Cole into the small study off the East Gallery, the same room where a Duke had once folded away a laundry note and told himself it was nothing, and asked him a single question. "How many servants dine below in this house, Mr. Cole?" 41, miss, counting the stable hands and the gardeners who take their meals with us." Then once a year, she said, "On this date, the anniversary of the day I was banned from my own wedding, every servant in this house will dine at the family table, not served at it, seated at it. I will not have another child scrub a floor for 12 years and be told she is nobody, not while I have any say over the tables in this house." Cole, who had served 3 generations of Stonefields and had never once in 41 years been asked to sit at that table himself, said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was not entirely steady. "Colonel Hartwell would be very proud of you, miss. Very proud indeed. He kept a promise for 20 years in a locked drawer, Mr. Cole. The least I can do is keep one for a single dinner a year." The Duke came to her a week before the anniversary dinner was to be held for the first time, standing in the doorway of the small sitting room she had been given, turning his hat in his hands the way a nervous young man turns a hat, though he was neither young nor, by any account she had heard, given to nervousness. "I have not properly asked your forgiveness," he said, "for the 6 weeks I spent choosing peace over truth, for choosing a wedding I did not even want over a promise I had made to a dying man. I do not know how a person earns forgiveness for that. I only know I intend to spend as long as it takes trying." Elowin considered him for a long moment, the way she had learned to consider everyone in that house for 12 years, carefully, without giving too much away too soon. "I will not forgive you today," she said finally. "Not because I wish to punish you, but because forgiveness given too quickly is worth very little to either of us. Give me a year, Your Grace. Prove to me, in a year, that the man who finally looked is the man who intends to keep looking, always, at everyone this house might otherwise forget. Then ask me again." The Duke bowed his head, and something in his shoulders eased, as though a year of honest work sounded, to him, like a gift rather than a sentence. "A year, then," he said. "I will not waste a single day of it." Old Cole liked to say, in the seasons that followed, sitting by the kitchen fire with a cup of tea he no longer had to hurry through, that a great house like Stonefield Abbey counts its silver every single morning, without fail, spoon by spoon, fork by fork, and calls that good order. But that same house had misplaced a living, breathing child for 9 years, and called that good order too, simply because nobody thought to count her. A person misplaced, he would tell the younger servants who gathered to hear the story on quiet evenings, is not the same as a person lost. Someone, somewhere, always kept the receipt. Sometimes it takes 20 years in a locked drawer for that receipt to be found. But it is always, always kept by someone who cared enough to remember. And now, before we close tonight's story, we leave you with the question every good story ought to leave behind. Duke Rainer Stonefield chose, for 6 long weeks, to look away from a truth that might have cost him his wedding and his peace before finally choosing to look. Elwyn Hartwell gave him a year to prove that choice was not simply guilt dressed up as love. Was that fair? Should a promise kept late still count as a promise kept at all? Or does the day he looked away matter just as much as the day he finally looked? Tell us in the comments below which side you stand on. Some faces, they say, are unlucky in a room. But it was never Elwyn Hartwell's face that brought this house its ruin or its rescue. It was the truth behind it, waiting patiently in a locked drawer for 20 years, for someone brave enough to finally turn the key. And when that key finally turned, in front of 300 witnesses in a chapel built for a wedding that never came, the only unlucky face left in that room belonged to the woman who had spent 9 years praying nobody ever would. This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.